Hello and welcome to the discussion. This channel is here to serve as a platform for scholarly discussions about some of the most significant questions regarding the history of early Christianity, the philosophy of religion, and systematic theology. My name is Nahoa, and I'm here to ask those questions, to seek truth openly and critically, and to share the journey with you. This first season is centered around the history of early Christianity, and especially the question of Jesus' resurrection. About a couple months ago, I had the opportunity and the privilege to speak with Dr. Dale Allison about his skeptical scenario, an alternative explanation to the resurrection, which he sees as comparably plausible. In this video, I have a new guest who will offer some of his own responses to Dr. Allison's work. The scholar about whom I'm talking earned his master's in philosophy from Biola University and his doctorate in theology from King's College, London. He's currently associate professor in the Department of Religion and Philosophy at Hong Kong Baptist University, and he has a wide variety of academic publications on a number of subjects, including the incarnation, evil and sin, the origins of divine Christology, the origins of humanity, and even the origins of the universe. Also, he's written a monograph on the resurrection, and more relevant to this video in particular, he has a forthcoming book in which he responds to a number of arguments about Christian origins, including those of Dr. Allison. So that's the speaker I have on today. Without further introduction, Dr. Andrew Loke. How are you?
Hi, Noah. Yeah, it's a great pleasure to be speaking to you today. I'm very well. Thank you.
Awesome. Yeah, wonderful. So I read your 2020 book, and it's actually open access. It's published by Routledge, and you can go on academia, the website, and just access it for free. I can have a link in the description. It's an awesome book, so I'm excited to ask you some questions. We're going to get into the resurrection reports, comparing the appearances of Jesus to the apparitions of Mary, and the presence of guards at the tomb, and much more. But first, let's start with the preliminaries. So, why is this question of Jesus' resurrection so significant? And moreover, why is Dr. Dale Allison such a notable New Testament scholar?
Well, the resurrection of Jesus is very significant because we need to consider the religious context of that event. So the context is that Jesus made claims about himself, which only the creator of the universe should make in the Jewish context. Now, I have argued for the historicity of these claims in my book called The Origin of Divine Christology, published by Cambridge University Press, where I responded to the objections by scholars such as Bart Ehrman and others, right, who claim that Jesus didn't make such claims. Well, I argue that they are wrong because if Jesus didn't make those claims, then the earliest Christian leaders, who were ancient Jewish monarchies, they wouldn't have come to the widespread agreement that Jesus was the one through whom are all things, right? Which refers to Jesus being on the creator side of the creator-creature divide. But the earliest Christians did make such claims, right? As we can read in the letters of Paul, for example, in 1 Corinthians 8:6, right? Paul claims that all things came through Jesus Christ. This I argue in my book that the earliest Christians did affirm that this highest Christology. So the highest Christology was already the earliest Christology. And I argue that the best historical explanation is that Jesus himself claimed and showed himself to be divine. And that's why the earliest Christians would regard him as such. And so, given that this is the case, right, then we have to ask whether uh, is it plausible that Jesus was lying, right? That he knew what he was talking about, but he knew that it was not true, but still he said that he's divine, or he didn't know what he was talking about, right? Perhaps he was uh, sincerely mistaken or deluded or uh, mentally incapacitated or something like that, right? So either he was a liar or he was a lunatic or deluded or mistaken or something like that. Now, however, if he did rise from the dead, right? If he did rise miraculously, then all those alternative hypotheses are likely, right? It's unlikely that he was sincerely mistaken. It's unlikely that a sincerely mistaken person can just rise from the dead miraculously. And it's also unlikely that he was just a liar, right, to deceive all humankind. And so given the resurrection, the best explanation is that he was truly divine, and his resurrection confirmed his claim. And so, if he was divine, then that is hugely significant because this gives us good reason to believe what he says to be true. I mean, if he's God, then he can tell us what is the meaning of life. If he's God, then he can tell us whether there's life after death. And if he's God, then he can tell us how we can have life after death, right? How can we can be redeemed from our sins, receive forgiveness for our sins, and receive eternal life by believing in him. And so the question whether Jesus rise from the dead or not is hugely significant, right, given this context. Now, concerning Dale Allison, yeah, he is a great scholar. He has written many big books about the New Testament, about Matthew, about Jesus' resurrection, a number of books on that. And in his books, you'll find that he does a very thorough survey of the relevant sources. And so many scholars appreciate him for that. And he also tries to be very balanced, right, in his assessment of the case for and against the resurrection. Right, so that's another reason why he is very well respected. Uh, but nevertheless, having looked at his books, I don't always agree with what he says. Right, so I mean, I agree with the basic facts that he established. Right, so he did agree that there was a person, Jesus. He died on the cross, and then a few days later, the tomb was empty, and then a number of people, right, groups of people actually, right, he agreed that groups of people claimed to have seen him alive. But his explanation of these facts, right, the skeptical hypothesis that he considered, now even though he didn't believe them himself, I mean, at the end of the day, he still believed that Jesus resurrected, right? But his analysis of the skeptical hypothesis, I think, gave too much weight to the skeptics actually, because I think that hypothesis is hugely problematic. And the way Allison discussed those hypotheses, I mean, he tried to draw parallels with apparition stories in other traditions, such as in Tibetan rainbow body, and also the apparitions of Mary. Now, I find his analysis problematic on a number of points, which I will point out later on. And also, he also draw analogies with like the seeing of Bigfoot. I think he mentioned that in the interview with you. No, I find that those are actually false analogies for a number of reasons. And I also pointed this out in an article published by Philosophia Christi, where I gave a review of his book and pointed out the flaws in his use of those psychology and parapsychological parapsychology literature. So yeah, so perhaps you can also put a link to the article in your in the description of this video, and so that readers can read the article and find out for themselves what are the flaws in reasoning of uh, Allison's arguments.
Sure. Yeah, I can put the link down, and I really appreciate that. I think that's totally fair, and also I like that you kind of draw a close connection between the resurrection and Christology. You understand the significance of the resurrection in large part in the context of his high Christology. That's right, right?
Yes, exactly, and also soteriology as well, right? That is why it's so important for us, right? Because it has huge importance for our salvation.
So with that, now on to my major questions. My first major question, my first couple have to do with the appearances of Jesus. So if the Gospels descriptions of the resurrection experiences closely resemble what Jesus' followers really did experience, then subjective vision hypotheses become much less tenable. I think you'd agree there. And so my question is just why should we trust the Gospel's reports of robustly physical postmortem appearances?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me share my slide. Okay, can you see my screen now? Yeah,
Yeah, we
is it
can.
coming out fine? All right. Okay, so choose the Gospel's descriptions of classical postmodern appearances. Now, I think there's a cumulative case that can be made, right, to demonstrate the historical reliability of these descriptions. And so, a cumulative case is a case in which there are multiple considerations taken together. And this is important because when we do history, it's important that we study in such a way, we study history in such a way that it will help us put ourselves into the shoes of the first century people, right? To get into their world, so to speak. right, to go outside the text and get into their world, the real world that they live in. And in order to do that, we need a number of we need multiple considerations, right, so that we can picture ourselves, right, in their situation. And that's why community case is so important. We shouldn't just uh, take one consideration and then consider it individually, right? Because if that's the case, then often you can find that there are counter examples, right, to those considerations. But when you put those considerations together, and then form that picture, then you'll find that it's very hard to avoid the conclusion that they did see something uh, that is robustly physical, right? So we need to put all these considerations together, right? So and that is an important point. Okay, so what are the considerations, right? So I have, I'm going to list them down. The first consideration is that there is multiple independent attestation, right, of such descriptions, and the second is that these details are foundationally important. I'll explain that later on. And thirdly, people that at that time they could check out with the eyewitnesses or people who knew the eyewitnesses. And by eyewitnesses, I put it in quote, right? It's a quote, it means that these are people who claim to have seen something. Okay, so people could check with them. And fourthly, the authors of the Gospels were known to first century Christian communities, and the Gospels contain primary sources. And fifthly, the historical context, which includes the context of persecution, which I'll mention later on. And sixth, the nature of the claim concerning resurrection. And then finally, considerations based on the general reliability of the New Testament. Okay, so I'm going to explain all these one by one, but remember, we have to take them together, right? Okay, now first, concerning multiple independent attestation. Now, when we look at the data, we'll note that we can know that this description of Jesus being robustly physical. Say for example, he can be touched, he can speak to crowds, he was seen by crowds together, a crowd of people together, and that he also ate and drank with the disciples, right? And this kind of descriptions are multiply attested in first century documents in the Gospel of Matthew, Luke, John, the book of Acts, and also we find this in the letters of Ignatius as well, which is written probably early second century or late first century, right? Historians dispute on that, but it's a pretty relatively early source, right? Whether it is first century, late first century, or early second century. So we find descriptions of this, right, in these sources, in these documents. And when we look at these documents, we'll find that there is
Wait,
a
I'm sorry.
diversity.
Just right before you continue, you mentioned Ignatius' letter to the Smyrnians, and in there he mentions that Jesus, that the reason the apostles were willing to embrace death and that they actually despised death was because of
Yes,
their robustly physical interactions with the raised Jesus. Do you think
yes.
that counts as independent attestation, or do you think he's borrowing from Luke there?
Yeah, that's a good question. Now, I'm going to talk about independent attestation later on, right? So it could be that he is dependent on Luke X, right? But then Luke X, I argue later as I'll explain later on. I think Luke X is actually independent. The account that we find in Luke X is actually independent of Matthew and independent of John as well. So you can consider Ignatius together with Luke X, and then this will be one body of information, and then this is independent of what you find in Matthew, and also independent of what you find in John. Yeah, so I'll explain that later on. Yes,
All right, that's fair.
and the second point is that even if Ignatius is dependent on Luke X, now it doesn't. We have to be careful here because sometimes people think that just because source A is dependent on source B, therefore source A is quite useless on its own. Now I don't think that is quite the case because when one source quote from another source, the source Ignatius, for example, right, he's not just a blind follower, right? So when people quote from other sources, right, they don't just anyhow quote from other sources. Uh, so very often they will also know about other information about that source. And generally, people don't quote from a source unless they have reason to think that that source is credible, right? That there is some credibility. And so, and so I therefore think that it is of some significance that somebody actually quote, right. Even if he's quoting from another source, I think that there's some significance there. At least that the source that he's quoting from is regarded or to be credible, right, in some sense. So so I don't think that just because source A is dependent on source B, therefore source A is useless, but rather I think the quotation is a kind of indication that there is some credibility to what is being quoted. Yeah.
All right, that's fair. You can
Okay.
continue. Let me pull up the slides.
Yeah. All right. So what I'll go on to say is that in spite of the diversity of details that you find in these sources, and also as I'll explain later on, there are some apparent contradictions. There are common elements that are readily discernible in the appearance traditions, which span a considerable portion of their diversity. And one of this is the robust physicality of the post-mortem appearances. Right, we find this is a common element. We find this in all these different sources, despite their diversity and apparent contradictions with one another. And this importance of observing repeated patterns across various characteristics and sources, as well as focusing on the overall impression that the sources give in making historical claims about Jesus, is important historically, as Allison also recognized in his book published in 2010 called Constructing Jesus. Right. So the sources is giving the impression that Jesus was witnessed to be robustly physical. That is the overall impression that the sources give. And it's important to look at this kind of overall impressions, and because if you want to get to the gist of the historical call, right, which Allison argues for. And so I think the gist is that that they are claiming that, that Jesus is robustly physical. That is what is being witnessed. Now let me say a bit more about the apparent contradictions. Right, we can find that there are a number of them. Say, for example, concerning the number of disciples at the first group appearance. So if you compare Luke X and John, right, you find that Luke mentioned the 11 in Luke 24. Um, but however, if you look at Gospel of John, you'll find that John says that at the first appearance, Thomas wasn't there, right? And then Judas will have already gone off. And so it should have left 10, isn't it? So is it 11 or 10, right? So there are apparent contradictions such as these. Um, you know, so what do they indicate? Now, I think that these contradictions are harmonizable. Now, I have explained in chapter 2 of my book, Investigating the Resurrection of Jesus Christ, published by Routledge. In that book, in chapter 2, I explain in detail how these apparent contradictions can be harmonized, right? Now, say for example, whether is it 11 or 10. Well, I think one way to harmonize this is to say that perhaps uh, Thomas was there initially together with the rest when he hear about somebody claimed that, oh, Jesus has appeared to Peter. But then Thomas may have said dismiss this, right? Say, unless I see him for myself, I won't believe it myself. And then he just and then he walked away. So he could be that he left in the middle or something like that, and that's why initially he was there, right? But later on, he left, and then Jesus appeared to the crowd, right? To the rest. Um, and then he appeared to the group again 1 week later with Thomas himself present, right? So that's one possibility. Now, because and the other possibility is that the word 11, right, could just be a label that Luke himself used, right, to label the group of people. So it doesn't necessarily imply that every single one of them were there. Now it's interesting to note that Paul in 1 Corinthians 15, he used the 12, right? Um, that Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 claimed that Jesus appeared to Peter, then to the 12, even though Paul should have known that, he probably would have known that Judas was no longer there, right? Yeah, because the account of Judas betraying Jesus, I mean, that is very well known among early Christians. And but Paul still used the 12, right, in that sense. So as a kind of label, right, not to say that there are exactly 12 there, but as a kind of label for this group of people. So and that's the reason why I suggest that another possibility is that this 11 could be just be used as a kind of label, right? And we also know that when the gospel writers write their accounts, they do not always intend to write a complete account of everything. right? So they only focus on certain details. And so the fact that Luke didn't mention that Thomas left or he wasn't present, that doesn't mean that Thomas was doesn't mean that Luke was implying that Thomas was there, right? Because as I said, the gospel writers, they often do not necessarily write a complete account of everything, right? They just focus on some points. And so uh, so because of all these reasons, I think that these differences can be harmonized. But nevertheless, you realize that the harmonization is not always immediately obvious, right? Yeah. So, and in some cases, it's not easy, right? For example, in this case, I don't think it's easy, but even though I think it can be harmonized, right? But it's not straightforward. So, given that this is the case, I think that it's unlikely that one account is merely copying from another, right? That is merely dependent on another, right? Because if one account is dependent on another account, then it's unlikely that the one would contradict the other in such a way, right? I mean, given that they are all trying to persuade people to believe in Jesus, right? I wouldn't want to contradict another person in that way, right? I don't want to contradict somebody else who is also trying to persuade other people to believe in Jesus. That doesn't make sense. And so if I am, so for example, if I'm the author, I try to use one account that is dependent on another. I will try to make sure that my account actually will fit quite nicely, right, with the source that I'm depending on. But when we look at the Gospels, we find that that's not the case, right? We find that there are all these apparent contradictions, which are quite hard to harmonize sometimes. So this actually indicate that there are actually multiple independent traditions, which were carefully preserved in the original form, which they were in the way that they originally the way that they originally were initiated in that original form. Despite their contradictions, they are still preserved in those forms, and they were then later written in the Gospels, right? So the Gospels actually preserve these multiple independent traditions in the way that they are, they were, right? Despite their apparent contradictions. And so this also indicate that these stories, they were not carefully made up by group of Christians getting together, and then all the four gospel writers coming together and say, hey, we are going to deceive people, right? So we draft up these four gospels, these four stories to deceive others. Why? Because if that's the case, then you have expect a much more carefully constructed case, carefully made up to make sure that there are no such difficulties, such apparent contradictions which are hard to harmonize at many times, to conspire to make people believe in their story, right? So that would be unlikely given all these difficult apparent contradictions. And on the other hand, all these apparent contradictions, which are carefully preserved in the traditions, as I said, this is what we would expect from first-hand accounts of a shocking event given by eyewitnesses very soon after the event, right? So, for example, right, if you, me, and somebody else, if we are going to see something shocking happen in front of us, right, and then we are going to tell other people. Other people ask us, what do you see, right? So we will be very excited. We will be saying things from our perspective of the story, and which may not always harmonize very well, right, with what other people also say, right, very soon after the event, right? So, yeah, so that's the reason why, as N.T. Wright puts it, the very strong historical probability is that, well, Matthew, Luke, and John describe the risen Jesus. They are writing down very early oral tradition, representing three different ways in which the original astonished participants told the stories, and they are carefully preserved in that, in that way. And so, irrespective of when the Gospels reach their final form, the strong probability is that these Easter stories they contain, the Easter stories they contain, go back to genuinely early oral traditions. So, what this implies is that even though the Gospels were written after the letters of Paul, nevertheless, they actually preserve traditions that were already being present even before Paul wrote his letters, right? In around, say, for example, Paul wrote 1 Corinthians 15 in AD 55. So, but these traditions that is preserved in the Gospels probably were already around before that. And Paul himself, when he wrote 1 Corinthians 15, he was also citing early traditions as well, right? So 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 to 11, many scholars agree, and I think they are right, including Allison as well, right? They think that Paul is actually citing even earlier tradition in that letter as well, right? So Paul says, what I receive, I pass on, right? So the list of eyewitnesses that's present in 1 Corinthians 15, that list of eyewitnesses that's present in 1 Corinthians 15, right? That tradition also came much earlier, way before AD 55. So what we have here is are multiple very very early traditions and accounts concerning the eyewitnesses, and also in the gospel, and also right, what is claimed to have been witnessed, right? That Jesus was witnessed to have been robustly physical in the accounts that are preserved in the Gospels. And this complement what we find in the tradition that's preserved in Paul, right? Because Paul didn't tell us the details of exactly what the 12 disciples witnessed, right? Paul says there were the 12, 500, and then another group of apostles. So Paul tells us in broad outlines, in a summary form, that there were multiple groups of people, right? In addition to individuals, right, who um, saw the risen Jesus, but what exactly did they saw? Did they see? Right? What are the details? Well, you find this in the accounts that are preserved in the Gospels. Right? They saw a Jesus who was robustly physical, right? Who can be touched, who uh, ate and drank with the disciples. So we find that these traditions actually complement what we find in the tradition that is preserved in the letters of Paul in 1 Corinthians 15. And the early Christian community, each early Christian community would preserve the memory of an appearance of Jesus to figures that are known to that community, and retain the memory of appearances with the local associations. And that the individual evangelists drew on one or the other of these local traditions available to them. Right? So after um, the after Jesus was crucified, and then later on, the early Christians, they perceived to have seen Jesus. They went on, to spread the gospel, right? So Peter traveled to some places, and then John traveled to other places, and when they traveled to different places, brought they brought people to believe in Jesus. They set up churches, they set up Christian communities, and those communities will preserve the traditions that they receive, right, from these apostles. And so when the evangelists, when the gospel writers write their accounts, right, that they will draw on, they drew right from these traditions which are available in these different communities. And so each of the authors, they would also chose, each of them, they will also choose from the pool of historical material consisting of the collection of early traditions, those details which address the particular needs of his audience, and told them according to his own style without changing the substance of the details, and thus explaining the differences between the Gospel's resurrection narratives. Right? I argue that they did not change the substance because, as I said, right, these are will have been these were carefully preserved. And also, I said that they chose those details which address particular needs. And so, say for example, in the Gospel of Matthew, right, this Gospel is widely regarded by scholars to have been written to the Jewish audience. Right, we find evidence of this in the Gospel of Matthew. Um, say for example, Matthew, he cites the genealogy, right, which trace Jesus, all the way to David, to Abraham, whereas in the Gospel of Luke, right, he traces it to Adam, right. So we find that in Matthew, right, that there's an emphasis on the Jewish descent of Jesus, and we find that also the way the way Matthew portrayed Jesus, is in many ways similar to Moses, for example, right. So Allison talks about this as well in his commentary. So all these evidence indicate that Matthew was written to a primarily Jewish audience, and among the Jews, there's a widely known story, a claim, widely known claim that the disciples stole uh, Jesus' body right after he resurrected. No, sorry, after he was crucified, the disciples stole the body, and that's the reason why Matthew had to address that need, that concern. Right, Matthew mentioned that there are guards at the tomb, right? Whereas this detail was not mentioned in other stories. Now, I'm going to talk about the God of Tomb later on, right? Because I think you're going to ask me that question, right? So I'm going to explain why I think that detail is historically reliable. But at this point in time, I just want to explain the differences, right, in the Gospels, and this can be explained by the different authors choosing different details to address different concerns. And they are not just, and these Gospel authors, they were not just making up stories, but rather they were choosing details from well-established traditions that were carefully preserved, right? So that's what I've argued so far.
So
Now, of
just
course,
real quick then,
yeah,
to ask a question on that. Um,
Yes.
So many scholars say that the Gospels had a pool of oral tradition that they preserved some of it, but they changed some of it, they redacted some of it. They would take things from earlier Gospels and redact it. And you're saying that just as plausible, if not more plausible, is the view that instead of changing their source material, they're choosing different elements of their source material to fit the needs of the purposes of their work and to be more applicable to their audience. So instead of saying, "Oh, yeah, Matthew," it's just a Mattean redaction that the guard story. It's just as a result of Mattean redaction that the guard story is there. He kind of made it up for apologetic purposes. You're saying, no, it was already there. The story predates Matthew, but he chose it for his apologetic purposes. Is that correct?
Uh, yes, that's correct. But I want to make one qualification, which is that we have to be careful about how the word redaction is defined, right? Now, redaction, right, does not necessarily mean that Matthew made up. Redaction just means that the author, right, he did some kind of editing of his material, right? Editing in the sense, not changing the substance, as I say, but rather put the way he put the stories together, right? What to say first, right? And the way to say it, right? The what detail to emphasize, right? So there is obviously a redaction in that sense because we see that the different gospel writers have their own individual literary style, right? Yeah, Matthew has his own Matthean style of telling a story. Luke has his own way of telling a story. So there is reduction in that sense. But however, I don't think that that reduction is actually changing the was actually changing the substance of the details, right? So the substance is that Matthew was saying that there was a guard, right? And I think that he got it from well-established tradition. He was not just making up the story that there was God out of nowhere. Yeah.
And that reminds me of something that Dr. Craig Keener, whom I've interviewed before, says, and Dr. Michael Lacona, who I'm going to interview soon, they say that the gospel authors, being ancient Greco-Roman historiographers, were at liberty to redact and to change things and to change the syntax or to have substitution or to paraphrase, but in the substance, in the gist of what occurred, they record reliably. You agree with that?
Yeah, that's right. Broadly speaking, I agree that they actually preserve the substance right in a reliable way. Yeah.
All right, so let's continue
Although,
with the
yeah, that's
presentation.
right.
Oh, okay.
Okay, sure. Yes. All right. Now, of course, skeptics have often objected that can find legendary embellishment in later accounts. So, say for example, if you read the account in Mark, Mark claims that there was a young man at the tomb, but rather Matthew said that there was a young man accompanied by earthquakes. Right. So, uh, but however, this objection fails. Is that when we look at the first century documents, we find that the details do not seem to follow a consistent pattern. So, for example, First Corinthians 15, which was written earlier compared to the Gospels. Now, this um, account in First Corinthians 15 mentioned that that Jesus appeared to more than 500 over people, right? But you don't find this detail in the Gospels, which were written later. So one might imagine that if the later accounts, if the accounts books that were written later, right, they tend to embellish things, right? They make up, exaggerate details, right? We might think that they might say that there were 5,000 or something like that, who saw Jesus, but we don't see that, right? So that is one difficulty with the embellishment theory. So instead of embellishment, I think that it's more likely that the authors, as I said earlier on, right, they took into consideration the needs of the audience when they decide the amount of details to include. And so, in the case of First Corinthians 15, right, we know that Paul was writing to the Corinthian church, and among them, there were some people who were skeptical of bodily resurrection. Right, so we read this in First Corinthians 15 chapter 15 verse 12. Right, some people among them didn't believe that there was bodily resurrection. And so Paul emphasized that Jesus appeared to more than 500, some of whom were still alive, right? Many of them were still around, so they can be checked and verified. Those evidence are still around. And that is obviously stated as a kind of way to prove that the resurrection happened, yeah, in a sense. Given Paul's emphasis, right, to address the need of the audience. And the details can be understood as clarifications rather than embellishments or modifications. Right. So, for example, the young man, right, in Mark. Now, when we read Mark, in fact, we can see that even Mark's portrayal of the young man indicates that it's not just a simple young man, because the young man pronounce things with kind of almost divine like with kind of authority that seems to indicate that he received kind of divine revelation that he just pronounced right to the women, and he was dressed in white. And we find that in other second temple Jewish sources such as Tobit and Second Maccabees, right? We find that young man is also used for angel, and so I don't think Matthew actually is changing the substance of the story in Mark, but rather clarifying, providing more details. So it could be just a matter of later author adding new but truthful traditions that were known to his community to fill in the gaps. Okay, so that is the first consideration, right, concerning multiple independent attestation. Now, the second consideration is that we need to understand that these details, the details concerning what the early Christians witness about Jesus, these details would have been foundationally important for the early Christian communities, right? Why? Because the evidentially significant details concerning the resurrected Jesus must have been told from the earliest days of Christianity, as people would surely have asked. And stories as community forming as these stories, the ones they are told, they are not easily modified because too much depends on them, as N.T. Wright puts it. Right? So, say for example, if today I'm going to go around telling other people that my father resurrected from the dead, and that he's God and things like that. Now, of course, a lot of people will just dismiss it, right? People will say, "Oh, this guy is crazy." But other people, for those people who are willing to consider it, the story, and who are willing to believe and who believe in the end, right? They would ask me details, right? So what exactly do you see, right? How do you why do you think it's your father but not somebody else, right? What how many people saw it, right? Do you all see things together, or is it just yourself? I mean, people will be curious, right, to find out details like this, right, before believing. And so, likewise, when the earliest Christians, when they go around telling the gospel, right, people, their audience would surely have asked exactly what do you see, right? And these details will have been very important, right? They will be foundationally important because this, um, because the resurrection of Jesus is of foundational importance for the earliest Christians' belief in Jesus as Lord. And the reason why they believed that Jesus resurrected was because there were these people who claimed that they saw him alive after he was crucified. And so people want to find out what exactly they saw, right? Because those details will be the foundation for why people would believe that they these people who claim that they saw Jesus alive, they truly saw Jesus alive, right? And so these details will be of foundational importance. And as Wright says, right, so when these stories, after they're being told, right, these details will be taken very seriously. They'll be remembered, carefully preserved, and once that is so, right, it will not be easy to modify these details because too much depends on them. So, in other words, the resurrection narratives. Now, I'm not. So, I'm referring to the narratives that were told right at the beginning, around AD 30, right, soon after Jesus was crucified. Once these stories were told, they would have been investigated properly by the early Christian communities. And not only so, but also they will have been preserved properly, right, given their importance as people would want to know, right? And thirdly, people could check out, right? Could check out with the uh, those original people who claim that they saw Jesus, or they could check out with those people who know these people, right, who claim that they saw Jesus. What is it that you heard from them? Right? What is it that they say? Right? And people could check out because we have evidence from inside and outside the Bible which indicate that the early Christian community, the early Christian movement was a network of close communication. There were people traveling around, sending letters, right, to uh, one another, And the early Christian leaders, including the apostles, they were quite mobile, right? They were moving around, sharing the gospels from one place to another. And moreover, many Jewish Christians scattered across the Roman Empire, they would have traveled every year to Jerusalem for religious festivals. So when people get together, right, they can ask one another, "What do you hear?" Right? Or, "What do you see?" And so the people can check out with one another. And I put a photo of the in my PowerPoint slide, right, the roads, right, in the ancient Roman Empire. So I'm sure you have heard that this this claim that all roads lead to Rome, right, which is a indication that, that the transport system in the ancient Roman Empire was not that bad, right? People there was this network of roads that people do travel around, and so the early Christians were also traveling, were indeed traveling around, interacting with one another, and so they could check with one another, they could check out about the traditions. And fourthly, the authors of the Gospels were would have been people who were known to the first century Christian communities. So these authors, they were not strangers, but they were not strangers, right? They would not have been strangers, right, to the early Christian communities. Why? Because by reading their letter, by reading the Gospels which they wrote, we can know that they themselves, the authors, whoever they were Christians themselves, living in first century Christian communities, which were founded by the apostles earlier on, apostles and their co-workers earlier on. So they were known to the communities, and these communities will have known who the original authors were, even if we don't. Now, of course, nowadays there are some skeptics, right, who doubt whether did Matthew wrote Matthew, right? Did the Apostle John wrote the Gospel of John, right? So there are all these debates, right? So even if we do not know who the original authors were, the earliest Christians would know, right? The early Christians would know, right? Because it will be member of their own community. And so they would have known who they were, and they would also have known what the apostolic message was, the tradition that was passed down to them. And so they can compare, right? Whether what is found in the gospel is reliable, fit with the tradition they receive or not. And since the first century was a period of living memory, that is the period from the first to early second century was the period of time within which people who could have known these so-called eyewitnesses or people who knew these eyewitnesses were still alive and could and would verify what they wrote. And this is a point that Keener have argued, right? So Keener not only argued that the Gospels were historical biographies, but that these were written during the time of living memory, and so these accounts would have been expected, right, to tell the truthful story, which could be verified by the readers. Now, I mentioned earlier on that there are these debates about who the real authors of the Gospels were. And no, there are skeptics who claim that the traditional authorship of the Gospels, um, there are those who claim that those that Matthew did not wrote Matthew, etc. But I don't think their arguments are compelling, right? Say, for example, many skeptics have claimed that, well, you don't find the name of Matthew actually being mentioned uh, in as the author, right, in the text itself. So, for example, in the Gospel of Matthew, you don't find that there's a verse that says that I Matthew wrote this, right? I got it from Jesus. We don't find such explicit statements, right, in the Gospels of Matthew. However, the absence of a name within the body of an ancient work, is entirely understandable because of other ways which the author might be identified. So, for example, uh, in addition to the body of text, we find that sometimes there's a superscription or an initial title above the main body of the work, or title pages, right, being added on top, or there could be the inscription of an author's name on the back of a scroll of a roll, or with a name tag insert into the roll. So these are various ways in which ancient authors indicate that they wrote these books. Now, even in the modern day, right, we still use such um, methods as well. Now, say for example, when I submit an article to a peer-reviewed journal, right? I was told to make my article in a way that I will remain anonymous in a way so that the article can be subjected to blind peer review. But on the other hand, I was also told by the website, uh, the submission website, to say that I have to submit a title page in which my name is indicated there, right? So I submit two documents. One is the text without the author's details, and the other is the text with the title page with the author's details. And so these two documents are submitted on the website, right? So if you just read the body of the text, you don't find my name. You don't find that I claim that I'm the one who wrote this, right? But if you read the title page, well, it's there, right? So these documents, can be submitted separately. They don't always necessarily go together. And we find that that is the case in, and so yeah, so that's not a problem, right? So objection is actually a bad objection. Now, moreover, the second century Christian literature is replete with references to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John as the authors of the Gospels. And there is never any sense that the Gospels were anonymous or written by others. So the early Christians, right? When we look at the early Christian sources, it seems that no, they all agree that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John wrote this. Right? There was no dispute about the authorship in the early church. And so, as I said, and also as I said earlier on, right, the early church would have known who the authors were. And so, given all these considerations, the most likely conclusion to be drawn is that the attributions of authorship are original. Right? That Matthew did wrote Matthew, Mark did wrote Mark, Luke did wrote Luke, and John did write John. And so, given that this is the case, when Matthew and John will be the primary sources, right? Because they were members of the 12. And Luke was someone who knew the primary sources. Luke states that just as those who were from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word have delivered them to us. Right? So Luke was a recipient of the message that was passed down from those eyewitnesses, the apostles who spread the message to him and others. And so he said that he has followed these things closely and he's writing an account of that. Okay, so Luke was so what this means is that the Gospel of Luke includes those traditions that he received from other primary sources, which were independent of Matthew and John, right? Because I already established early on, right, that these traditions they contain independent traditions, right? And so this is very powerful. So this is very strong historical evidence, right? That we have multiple independent attested sources and also primary sources, right? We do have primary sources of um, what was witness, right, of how Jesus appeared, right, to people.
Now, wait, just
And
before we go
so there
on,
are other arguments.
is it all right if I
Yes.
ask a question? Okay, so you mentioned that second century Christian literature is replete with references to Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John as being written by Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John. I was
Yeah.
wondering, so the earliest extra biblical Christian evidence we have comes from the apostolic fathers, uh, Clement of Rome, Polycarp, and Ignatius from the late first century to early second century. So, for those scholars who affirm a sort of anonymous gospel theory and think that maybe attributions of traditional authorship originated with Papias or maybe even the Muratorian fragment or Irenaeus sometime later on, for them, would it not could it not be seen as evidence for that view that the earliest apostolic fathers, Clement, Polycarp, and Ignatius, although they quote the Gospels, especially the Synoptics, they don't refer to the authors. They don't. There's no attribution of authorship in our earliest Christian evidence. So, how would you respond to an argument like that?
So you to understand that these letters were occasional documents, right? I mean, they were written to particular communities with specific needs. So, they were not intended to be a complete record of everything that is known, right, in among the earliest Christians. And so, if Clement of Rome see a need, right, to tell his audience who the authors were, then we won't. Then it won't be surprising, to find that he didn't actually mention them, right? But whereas Irenaeus, right, he was writing during a time when there was a dispute with the Gnostics, for example, right? And so it will be important for Ignatius, for Irenaeus, sorry, not Ignatius, Irenaeus, right? It will be important for him, right, to specify, right, who the authors actually were. And by the way, it's also interesting that the Gnostics themselves actually agree that the Gospel of John was written by John, right? Even though they may disagree about other authors. And so, in the case of the authorship of Gospel of John, we actually find that the Gnostics themselves also agree. But even though they may disagree about others, right? So we find that this the disagreements among them actually can be traced to um, traditions that was already present earlier on, right? So Irenaeus was not inventing things out of nowhere, right? But there was already a debate, a preceding debate that was going on. And then, of course, there was also Marcion, right, who earlier on, right, tried to create his own canon, right? So, so all these things were already taking place, right, before Irenaeus, right, specify, right, the authors. And what we then realize is that other Christian communities, they did not dispute with Irenaeus concerning who the authors were. And this will be quite strange, right? If because as I said, right, the original communities, the earlier communities, communities in the first century, right? They or the gospels were written in the first century, and the communities in the first century would have known who the authors' origin were, and they will have passed down information about this, right, to the second century, right, to the communities which come down from the first century, and if there were any um, information that they had, which was passed down, which was in conflict with what Irenaeus was saying in the middle of the second century, right, then they would raise some disputes. And we find that, in fact, there were disputes, right, among in the second century, third century, fourth century, for example, concerning the exact delineation of the canon, for example, right? So they were disputing whether Hebrews was written by Paul or by somebody else. So we do find that there were such disputes, right? So the early Christians were not stupid, and they were not blind followers. They were not saying, oh, because Irenaeus says so, therefore we all believe. No, right? We find that they do raise objections, if they have, if they thought that there was some reason for disagreement, but we don't find them raising any disagreement, any objections, right, to these four authors, right? And so what this indicates is that Irenaeus was actually citing tradition that is well established from early on, right? That these authors were indeed the authors of the four gospels.
All right, that's fair. If that's what you want to say there, then we can continue on with the presentation.
Yes, and by the way, I'm quoting from an article published. Now, what I've just shared is not just my own argument, right? Because I'm actually quoting from many other scholars. So I'm citing from Craig Keener, who has defended the traditional authorship of Gospel of John, and also Matthew. And I'm also citing here an article written by Simon Gaedeke, who is a well-known New Testament scholar at the University of Cambridge, right? So I think he's at least as respectable as Dale Allison or others, or those other skeptical scholars. And in this, and Simon Gaedeke, he wrote this article, the defending the view which I just said, right, in an article published in the Journal of Theological Studies, which is published by Oxford University Press. So this is one of the top academic journal in the world that investigate the history, the historical critical issues concerning Christianity, right? So it's not just a theology journal, right, but it's also a historical critical journal as well, looking at examining the sources and their historicity, etc. Right, and this journal is peer reviewed, right? So I'm actually quoting good sources, right, for my views, right, and presenting the arguments for why I think that the traditional authorship is defensible. No, and it cannot just simply be dismissed, right? And as I said, the objections are actually not compelling. Okay, so let me go on and say something more, right? Because as I said, I'm presenting a cumulative case here, right? So all these reasons taken together give us good reasons to provide good reasons to show that the Gospels do indeed contain primary sources. So I already presented a number of considerations. Now, in fact, I think that the skeptics' arguments, in fact, contribute to my case as well. So I've been reading this Jesus mythicist called Raphael Lataster. Now, he didn't even believe that Jesus existed, right? And he claims that there were no primary sources, and because he didn't believe that the Gospels were primary sources. And he says that this dearth of primary sources is also very surprising, given Jesus' alleged fame, right? So Lataster is claiming that if Jesus actually existed, right, we should expect some primary sources. But he thinks that there is no primary sources, because he thinks that the Gospels are not primary sources, and therefore he thinks that Jesus didn't existed, right? Didn't exist, right? So he's a mythicist. He's a mythicist, right? Now, of course, we know that most historians disagree with Jesus' mythicists for good reasons, right? Say, for example, Bart Ehrman will argue that Paul knew the brother of Jesus, right? Paul knew James, who was the brother of Jesus. So Jesus had brothers, right? So there must be a real Jesus. And also, we find multiple attestation of the existence of Jesus as well, right? And so there is good evidence to believe that there must have been somebody who started the Christian movement, right? And that person was Jesus, right? So we have good reasons to believe that Jesus actually existed. Now, given that that's the case, if there were no primary source, then that would be surprising, right? Given Lancaster's arguments, and because Jesus would surely have been famous among the early Christians who knew about him, who believed that he was God. And moreover, multiple documents, the 27 documents of the New Testament, were all written within the first century, and this indicate that they were Christians, they were people among the early Christians who can write, right? They were not all illiterate, right? They can write documents. In fact, 27 is a large number, right? From the first century, 27 documents about things that are related to what Jesus taught and what the early Christians were teaching, right? So this is a large number of documents which shows that people among the early Christians, they could write. So given these two considerations, it will be improbable, it will be surprising if there were no primary source written by any Christian with the help of scribes or otherwise within the first century. And so I think that and the first and the sources from the first century, the gospels that are worthy of considerations, right, are the four gospels we have. Why? Because we know that the so-called Gnostic gospels, right, or the Gospel of Judas, whatever, or Gospel of Thomas, whatever, those were written much later. They had no, they had far less historical credibility compared to the four gospels we have, which were all written in the first century. So those will be the best candidates for the primary sources. They'll be the best candidates for what contained the primary sources. Now we know that Luke was not an original disciple, right? As I mentioned earlier on, Luke was not the original disciple, but Luke include primary sources in his gospel, even though he was not originally one of the 12. I already argued that earlier on. And so the best historical conclusion is that the four gospels, they were either written as primary source or they contain primary source, right? They were written by somebody who is not the 12, but they contain primary sources, which came from the 12. And this was known by the earliest Christians, right? And so this will be another consideration for thinking that the Gospels do contain primary sources. And so all these considerations taken together with the conditions, taken together with those considerations offered by Simon Gaedico, right, from the University of Cambridge, as well as other considerations I noted earlier on about the traditions who have been carefully preserved, indicate that at least some of the Gospels are primary sources or contain reliable information from primary sources concerning the evidentially significant details regarding Jesus' resurrection appearances. Right, and the overall impression that these sources give is that Jesus was witnessed to be robustly physical, right? And so, as I said earlier on, even though the Gospels were written later than Paul's letters, but nevertheless contain oral traditions which have been circulating from the earliest days of Christianity, and that these traditions were carefully preserved and contain historical information which complement that in Paul's. Now, there is another consideration which I can add on, right? And which is that another skeptic, Daniel Lidwar, right? So he claims that the Gospels were written as historical in the genre of historical biographies, um, in order to make the audience believe what they wrote, even though Lidwar thinks that the details in the Gospels were not historically reliable. No, but they were presented in a format that appears to be historically reliable to the audience. Why? Because Litwa himself notes that the Gospels writers, they were highly intelligent people, right? So Matthew, Luke, etc., right? The Gospels were very well crafted in a way, right? It shows that the authors were highly intelligent. So they were not stupid people, right? They carefully write the Gospels, and they are choosing to write in the genre of historical biographies indicate they have wanted to write in such a way that educated people would understand and accept what they wrote as true. Since more and more educated and high status people were joining the Christian movements during that time. Now, Litwa also notes that generally speaking, if readers do not consider a story to be real, they do not consider it to be plausible. So all these considerations indicate that the first century readers of the Gospels were concerned about truth, and they were not just blind followers. They were concerned about truth, right? They want to find out what is true. And that this was known by the Gospels authors such that they chose to write in the genre of historical biographies. Now, given that these intelligent authors would also have known that their readers were in the position to verify and falsify some important details relevant to Jesus' resurrection, as I have argued earlier on, they would not have made up those details, right? Because they know that if they made up, it will have been falsified, and nobody will believe what they write. Now, this consideration, which I highlight in yellow, is a consideration that is neglected by Litwa, right? And that's why Litwa can go on to claim that, oh, the gospel writers just make up those details. But I think Litwa's objection is false. Why? Because Litwa fails to consider this consideration, which I argued for earlier on, which is that the early Christian communities, they were tightly networked, right? They could find out, right? And they would find out, right? And they could verify whether these details were historically reliable or not. So, given this consideration, and as well as the consideration that Litwa himself noted, we have very good reasons to believe that the details are indeed historically reliable. And the next historical consideration I want to mention is the historical context, which is that the early Christians, they were willing to suffer persecution. Now, regardless of whether how many of the 12 eventually did die for their faith, right? So there's dispute about that. But we know that they would have to be willing to suffer persecution. Why? Because they were proclaiming and following a leader who was himself persecuted and even crucified, right? So Jesus himself was crucified. So given this background, right, if people still want to proclaim him after he was crucified, they would evidently have to be prepared to face persecution too, right? And we do find that there are also um, evidence of early Christians being persecuted. I mean, we find mentioning of this in many early sources, right? In the letters of Paul, in the book of Acts, we find that there are all these accounts and multiple accounts of how the early Christians were indeed persecuted for their faith. And moreover, we also need to understand that the early Christians were ancient Jewish monotheists, as I pointed out earlier on. Now, for the ancient Jews, they wouldn't have easily believed that a human being is divine. That would have been very difficult, right? Because the ancient Jews were very different compared to the ancient Romans or the ancient Egyptians or the ancient Chinese or Indians in that regard, right? Because we find that in those other ancient cultures, they were polytheistic. They were polytheistic, and for those cultures, it would be very easy for them to believe that someone became divine after he died, right? But this was not the case for the ancient Jews. So even though the ancient Jews respected David, but they did not worship David, right? Even though they respected Abraham, but they didn't worship Abraham. So why were the earliest Christians who were ancient Jews, why would they worship Jesus? Why would they regard Jesus as divine? Now, they wouldn't have come to that conclusion, as I pointed out earlier on, unless they witnessed that Jesus claimed and showed himself to be divine. And the most important way in which Jesus was understood to have showed himself to be divine was through his resurrection, right? And so this indicates that the details concerning Jesus' resurrection appearances would have been foundationally important, as I argued earlier on. So if we put all these considerations together, we can arrive at the conclusion that now, firstly, no groups of people will be willing to sacrifice everything for what they know is false, and to be sent to hell by God for being false witnesses. And for them, for the earliest Christians, they would, given their ancient Jewish monotheism, they would believe that lying about a fundamental matter concerning their faith would be inconsistent with their devotion to the one God of Israel. For according to their Jewish faith, to mislead people to believe that Jesus was truly divine by making up his resurrection and the details concerning the resurrection, right, to make people believe, right, this would be judged guilty as false witnesses, and this will be condemned by the God of Israel as idolatry. And it will not only lead themselves, but also the rest of humankind astray. This is something that they would believe, given their historical context. So we find that, given these considerations, we have good reason to think that these early Christians, these apostles and people, they were not just making up details, right, to to make people believe that Jesus resurrected, right? Because this will be condemned as idolatry, and nobody will be willing to die for what they know is false. Even though a lot of people will be willing to die for what they believe is true, even though that may not be true, but you won't find a group of people who will be willing to die for what they know is, who will be willing to be persecuted and sacrifice everything for what they know is false, and to be sent to hell by God for idolatry, right? For being false witnesses, for proclaiming idolatry. And when we compare this historical context with, say, for example, the historical context concerning Alexander the Great, now we know that in the case concerning Alexander the Great, there were people who make up stories about him, there were legendary embellishments about him, claiming that he did some miraculous things and things like that. However, those who embellished the accounts of Alexander, they did not have to be willing to suffer persecution, right? There will be nothing to lose for them. In fact, they may even be promoted, right, for doing that. No, they wouldn't have to be willing to suffer persecution for their belief in Alexander. And the details of those embellishments, they were not of foundational importance, right, for Alexander. But the opposite is the case for Jesus' resurrection, as I've already explained. Moreover, there were hostile people who knew about Jesus and who bothered to get him crucified, and who did challenge the claims of early Christians. Right, so I mentioned earlier on, right, when the Christians claimed that Jesus resurrected, there were Jews who claimed that Jesus' disciples stole the body of Jesus, right? And when we read uh, other accounts written by other opponents of Christianity, we find that some of them, they say, for example, in the second century, um, there's a guy called Celsus, right, who claimed that perhaps the disciples hallucinated, right? So they try to explain away the resurrection. And so, and this is perfectly understandable, right? Because people who are hostile to the Christians, they will of course try to find alternative ways, right, to explain away the resurrection. So they will of course be expected to challenge the claims of the earliest Christians. And we do know that there were these hostile people in the first century, right? Because they bothered to get Jesus crucified. So they would obviously be challenging the Christians. And given that, and given the ancient Jewish monotheistic context of the earliest Christians, arriving at the divine view of Jesus, one that regard Jesus to be on the creator side of the creator-creature divide, through whom are all things, as 1 Corinthians 8:6 says, this would have been extremely difficult unless there was overwhelming powerful evidence of his divinity and resurrection in the first place, right? So um, those details, they were not embellished, but those details were indeed what the earliest Christians witnessed. The earliest Christians witnessed Jesus to be robustly physical, and that's the reason why they believe that he resurrected and they believe that he's God, right? So details must have been true in the first place, right, in order for them to arrive at the belief that Jesus resurrected and that he's God in the first place.
So, with these considerations about the historical context, am I getting this right when I say that you're not just arguing for the sincerity of the apostles, but also for the sincerity of all the evangelists, the gospel authors in their description of the details, and also that if there wasn't robust evidence of a physical bodily resurrection, it wouldn't have convinced these ancient monotheistic Jews that Jesus had risen as the glorified Lord, through whom are all things. Is that an apt summary of what you're saying?
Now, what I was saying is that I have already argued earlier on that the Gospels contain traditions that came from earlier on, right? That came earlier. And I've already argued that they contain primary sources, which means that they came from the apostles themselves. And so my argument there concerns the apostles primarily, right? Now, you're asking whether these considerations also apply to the Gospels authors. Now, my argument doesn't depend on establishing that. Why? Because some people may dispute. As I said earlier on, right? There are some people who argue that Matthew did not wrote Matthew, right? Mark did not wrote Mark, and Luke, right? Even if Luke wrote Luke, but Luke wasn't one of the 12, and Luke was not a Jew, right? He was probably a Gentile, right? So some of those considerations may not necessarily apply to the gospel authors. But my argument just now, in my most recent slide, was not about the gospel authors. It was about the original apostles, right? The earliest Christians, right? Who existed before the gospels were written. And I already argued that the Gospels contain tradition that came
Right.
from them, right, from these earliest people. Right? I'm arguing that they didn't get the details, but they were telling what they actually witnessed.
So you've expanded the scope of your
So,
argument
so, so, and
to.
so my and so it's important to make this point because it's important to make this point because the point I just made indicate that my argument, my conclusion is independent of whether the gospel authors, regardless of who they were, right? Yeah. So my conclusion will still stand.
All right, so that's meant to sort of expand the scope of your presentation, not just to the gospel authors
Mm.
and where traditional authorship might be disputed, but also to the
Mm.
apostolic witnesses themselves.
Exactly. That's right. Yeah. So remember, I'm making a cumulative case here, right? So I'm saying that there are all these various considerations, and even if one of the considerations fail, my argument can still stand, right? Because my argument is based on multiple considerations taken together, and so even if the gospel authors, they were not who they were traditionally thought they were, my argument can still stand based on other considerations which I've established.
All right.
Okay. Uh, so Now, the next point I want to make is that concerning the nature of the claim concerning resurrection. Now, so what does resurrection mean? This is also another important consideration. Now, Allison and others have mentioned that often people have bereavement experience. So after somebody loved one died, very often those people would have a vision of the loved ones. I myself had such experience. So after my father passed away, sometimes I have a sense of his presence, right? But I do not think that he rose from the dead bodily, right? And neither do the rest of my family. Why? Because the latter is, of course, much harder to believe, right? Compared to just sensing the person of the deceased, which is quite common. Um, Believing that somebody actually bodily exited the grave, now that would be much uncommon, right, compared to the former. And so, given that this is the case, it is more likely that some solid evidence, such as seeing my father together with other people, and perhaps eating and drinking with him together, now such um, such experience would have much higher explanatory power for explaining why me and my family would believe that he's body alive, right? If we had such belief. And this will also explain, so I'm arguing that this is the case, right, for the earliest Christians. It is more likely than not, right, compared to the alternative, that there were some solid evidence, such as the disciples seeing Jesus as a group and eating and drinking with him, in order to bring about the widespread agreement among them that a resurrected corpse was what they witnessed rather than just a spirit or whatever, and to believe that Jesus is God and to persist in holding on to these beliefs as their foundational belief in the context of persecution, right? Okay, so so the conclusion that the details were indeed robustly physical, right? This has higher explanatory power compared to the denial of this hypothesis.
Now, what Dr. Dale
Mhm.
Allison might say in response, and I clarified this in my interview with him, he wouldn't say
Yes.
that the psychological explanation by itself can explain the origin of belief in his resurrection. So he'd say there has to be more, sort of physical, like in person evidence of that. But he wouldn't say it would. He wouldn't say that evidence takes the form of robustly physical experiences. He would say it's, the skeptic could say it's subjective visions plus the empty tomb, which is itself solid evidence that a normal person might have of a deceased loved one. So it's the appearances plus the empty tomb plus a pre-Easter eschatological expectation, or if not expectation, then at least hope. So it's the three of those. It's not just robustly physical details versus subjective vision hypothesis. It's robustly physical details versus the three elements of his skeptical scenario.
Yes. Thank you, Nahua, for mentioning this. And so I'm going to address this right now. Okay. So these three things that you noted that Alison mentioned. Now, first, my response is that firstly, we need to understand that for the earliest Christians, what is it that convinced them that Jesus resurrected in the first place? Now, as I noted earlier on, if you look at the historical data, the earliest sources, the earliest account is that the reason why they came to the widespread agreement among themselves that Jesus resurrected in the first place was because of the appearances. It was not so much about the empty tomb actually, because the early Christians also recognized that the empty tomb can have alternative explanation, right? For example, in the Gospel of John, right, even though John himself believed after he saw the tomb empty, but other people did not, right? Thomas did not, according to the Gospel of John. Thomas did not. Mary was wondering whether somebody else took the body away, right? So the empty tomb by itself is not a fundamental reason for how the earliest Christians come to the widespread agreement. I mean, one or two individuals may believe after they see the tomb empty, like say for example John, but to have a widespread agreement among them, right? That the group of them all came to believe eventually, such that eventually they came to proclaim Jesus resurrected and was willing to suffer persecution for it. Now, the widespread agreement among them, that requires something more powerful. And for the earliest Christians, it was the appearances, and that's also the reason why when Paul he wrote the book of First Corinthians, right, addressing people who were skeptical of bodily resurrection. He emphasized on the appearances rather than the empty tomb, right? He didn't even mention the empty tomb actually for Paul, right? Even though he implied that the tomb was empty by saying that he was buried and then he was raised, but he didn't even specifically mention the empty tomb, right? But he was emphasizing the appearance, to the 12, to the 500, many of whom were still alive, right, to be verified. So, and Paul was quoting the earliest tradition, right, in First Corinthians 15. He was quoting tradition that already predates, right, that he received, that he passed on. So this indicates that for the earliest Christians, that the appearance is the fundamentally important evidence for them. Now, could it be that they interpreted the appearances in light of their end time beliefs, as what Allison said, right? So you were saying that Allison said that the disciples had this kind of eschatological belief, right? They believe that the end time is going to come soon, and this affect how they interpreted the appearances. This affect how they interpreted their experiences. Now, I think that Edison's hypothesis is not plausible. Why? Because these kind of end time beliefs were actually very common, right, during that time in the first century. And despite these beliefs being very common, and that there were also other Jewish messianic groups, movements being common around the first century. So there were other people like Theudas or others, for example, who claimed to be Messiah or some sort. But despite this being common during that time around the first century, in not one single case do we hear the slightest mention of the disappointed followers claiming that their hero had been raised from the dead, as N.T. Wright pointed out. Why? Because they knew better, because the resurrection was not supposed to be a private event. So, as I said, we need to understand what resurrection means. Resurrection means it's not meaning a private event that people just experience subjectively, that's just in your own heart or your own mind, or you just see it by yourself. Rather, it's supposed to be a public event in the sense that there should be group of people who see it together, right? And it's because, as I said, resurrection is the dead body will become alive again, and which can be witnessed by a group. That is what it's supposed to mean. And so this indicates that solid evidence will be required to persuade the authors, the apostles themselves, and also their audience, that they have actually seen Jesus resurrected. Now, another problem with Allison's hypothesis is that he failed to consider the audience. Now, Allison just thought about how the apostles themselves might have come to believe that Jesus resurrected, right? Because of the apostles, their own end time beliefs, right? But what about people in Corinth, right? What about the Gentiles? What about people who did not necessarily share those end time beliefs, right? How did they, the audience, right? These people who heard Apostle Paul preach to them, right? Who read the letters of First Corinthians, how did they, came to set up churches and were willing to suffer persecution, right? Uh, so when Paul wrote First Corinthians 15 to them, Paul says, why are we suffering? Why are we going through this, all this, right? What is it all for, right? If Jesus did not rise from the dead, then your faith is futile, Paul told them. And Paul says that the reason why we should believe, Paul was telling the Gentile, the audience, which include Gentiles among them, right, the Corinthians, that we should believe because Jesus was witnessed, right, to be alive. More than 500 people saw him at the same time, right? Paul was emphasizing the point. So, to persuade the audience, the apostles they will need to have something to tell others, right? If they just tell other people, oh, I have this kind of subjective experience, which I thought it was the resurrected Jesus because of my end time beliefs, right? The other people will laugh at it, right? They will say this is hilarious, because as a resurrection, you are saying that a dead body become alive again, and this is not supposed to be just kind of subjective experience. This is supposed to be something. If a dead body become alive again, then this should be at least seen by multiple people, right? At least. So the audience will find a hard time believing that. Um, so Allison, no, he did not actually consider this point about the audience of the early Christians, and so this is another problem, right, to Allison's hypothesis. And because of all these considerations, is no wonder, because of the consideration of the audience, right? It's no wonder, it's not surprising why the followers of Theudas, of others, they wouldn't even think about, right, claiming that their leader was alive again, because they would understand that nobody else will believe them, right? I mean, it will be very hard for other people to believe. So that's the reason why we don't find any slightest mention of the disappointed followers claiming that their hero was alive, because it would have been utterly implausible, not only for themselves but also for others, for their audience as well. And that's the reason why Jewish revolutionaries whose leader had been executed by the authorities and who managed to escape arrest themselves had only two options: either give up the revolution or find another leader. Claiming that the original leader was alive again was simply not an option. Was simply not an option, right? Unless, of course, he was resurrected. So this is my response to Allison. Now I have further response in my later slide, right? But I think this is part of the response to Allison. I have already pointed out some problems with Allison's hypothesis. Now, he didn't consider those things I mentioned earlier on, and so I want to reiterate again, right, that for the earliest Christians and their audience, it is the appearance which is of fundamental importance. It is not the empty tomb. So even if the empty tomb may have predisposed some people among them to believe that he resurrected, that wouldn't have been convincing, right, for the audience and for others, and or to bring about a widespread agreement among themselves. among the 12, among the 500, among these people who were claiming that they saw the resurrected Jesus, it wouldn't have started this widespread agreement to start the Christian movement in the first place and to sustain the movement over time in spite of persecution and challenges and opposition, right, from hostile witnesses. Okay, so and by the way, this is only one of the considerations, right? As I mentioned, we also need to take this into and take this together with other considerations which I mentioned earlier on and later on. And so, taken all this together, we will find that Allison's hypothesis is even more implausible, given other considerations which I mentioned earlier on and which I'll mention later on as well. And now, let me move on to the next consideration, which is that the fact that the Gospels, that we have other indication for the general reliability of the Gospels. So, as Craig Keener has pointed out, the fact that the Gospels use recent traditions and that those which can be checked, especially Luke, for example, Luke was using the tradition that is found in Mark, for example. That they are careful in their use of the sources, indicate that the Gospels should be placed among the most rather than the least reliable of ancient biographies. And Keener also go on to point out that biographies written within the living memory of their subjects were expected to provide accurate information about their subjects. And this point is important. Why? Because there are people there are skeptics like Lidwar, for example, who have claimed that sometimes ancient biographies they can still include some details which they made up, right? But Keener pointed out in response that we have to consider whether those biographies were written within the living memory of their subjects or not. And those that were, right, such as the Gospels, they were expected to provide accurate information. And I have also argued earlier on, right, this information could be checked, it could be verified with um, by others during that time. And Allison himself observes that ancient Jewish readers found their past in the so-called historical books of their scriptures, which were understood by them as relating to what really happened, right? So they truly believe that Moses and the Israelites crossed the Red Sea, right? Even regardless of whether that actually happened or not, right? But that is what the ancient Jews themselves actually believe. So they understood their ancient scriptures as telling historical truths, and there is also evidence that the early readers of the Gospels understood the Gospels in this way as well, right? So these are additional considerations for thinking that the Gospels are reporting what actually happened. And we can think about the general reliability of the New Testament as also a kind of a cumulative case. We can use the four E's, which is formulated by Frank Turek. Now, he also mentioned other E's, but he highlighted these four. And so this indicate that the New Testament is much more reliable compared to, say, ancient Buddhist scriptures or Taoist scriptures, which I have also looked at as well. So the New Testament is much more reliable compared to other texts or other such scriptures. Why? Because firstly, the first E is early, right? The New Testament documents were written in the first century, during which the apostles and their co-workers or people who knew them were still around and can be verified. And William Lane Craig has pointed out that it's more important. What is more important is not the time gap between us and the document, right? Even though these documents were written long time ago, but what is more important is the time gap between those documents and what they were supposed to be about, right? Uh, say for example, right, if I were writing about my ancient ancestor, even though I write it now, right, even though the time gap between that document and us now is very close because I'm still alive, right? But that document wouldn't be of any good historical value because it's written so long after my ancestor lived, right? So those will not be based on any eyewitness testimony or whatever that can be verified by the contemporaries. So whereas the New Testament was written very close, right, to the time of the contemporaries, within the first century, and so it is good evidence. And good evidence does not cease to be good just because it is old. Right? Just because the New Testament was written long ago, doesn't mean that it didn't contain good evidence. On the contrary, we have good reason to think that the New Testament does contain good historical evidence, as I've argued. And moreover, they have eyewitness basis, which I've argued as well. And also we find that they contain embarrassing details. details which people wouldn't want to make up unless it is undeniably true, well known to be true by the audience. So this indicate that there was no covering up, no made up stories. For example, um, the authors did not try to cover up the fact that the male disciples fled while women remained and discovered the empty tomb. This would have been quite embarrassing to their own leaders who were supposed to be these disciples, right? So it's an embarrassing detail, which the Gospels nevertheless include. And there's also extra biblical evidence. So we find that there are other first and early second century documents agreeing with many details in the New Testament, right? So, for example, the crucifixion of Jesus was also mentioned by Tacitus in the second century, and the fact that Jesus had a brother called James, right? This was also mentioned in Josephus in the first century. So there are these details, and Jesus' crucifixion was also mentioned by other people, right? In like Lucian, Phlegon in the second century as well. And so, um, we find these agreements there, and also archaeological discoveries. Say for example, the discovery of the pool of Bethesda, the Delphi inscription. These are all well-known archaeological discoveries that confirm various details in the New Testament, which skeptical scholars used to doubt, right? But nowadays, nobody doubt that there are such places, and that there are these details are true. So the New Testament, and so these four E's, right? Early eyewitness basis, embarrassing details, extra biblical evidence, taken together as a cumulative case, give us good reason to believe that the New Testament is generally reliable. These people are not just um, telling novels or what, right? But they are trying as best as they could, right, to write down things that actually happened and has been verified, right, in many cases to be indeed true. And so when we take this consideration together with other considerations which I've established so far, we find that there is very powerful cumulative case to establish the fact that the Gospel's description of the robustly physical post-mortem appearances of Jesus is indeed true, right? And so these considerations include, firstly, we have multiple independent attestation of this fact. And secondly, these details are foundationally important for the earliest Christians, and people could check out with the eyewitnesses or people who knew these eyewitnesses about what they saw, and the authors of the Gospels were known to the first century Christian communities, regardless of whether who we know who they actually were, right? Um, so my argument doesn't depend on establishing the traditional authorship, as I've argued earlier on. Even though I do think that there is good reason to believe in the traditional authorship, which adds further to the strength of my case. And I have already established that the Gospels contain primary sources, regardless of the traditional authorship. And moreover, the historical context of persecution, of the ancient Jewish monotheism of the earliest Christians, and the nature of the claim concerning resurrection, and finally, the general reliability of the New Testament. So all these evidence taken together give us good reason to believe that the Gospel's description of robustly physical postmortem appearances, these are true, and this would also refute the skeptical hypothesis that Allison and others have suggested. Okay, I
Wow.
shall pause here. Mhm.
Yeah, that's an amazing amount of information.
Yeah.
Just that alone has taken an hour, hour and a half. So,
Oh,
but I love it. No, I love it. It's good. You have time still, right?
I have time. Yes. Mhm.
Okay, great. So now my next question is still about the appearances, so it's still sort of in this vein. Um,
Okay.
Dr. Gary Habermas and I think Dr. Joseph Bergeron wrote an article about about psychiatric explanations for the resurrection of Jesus. And one thing they point to is that hallucination. Hold on, let me sort of gather my thoughts real quick. Okay, So, Dr. Gary Habermas and Dr. Joseph Bergeron wrote an article arguing against psychiatric explanations for the postmortem appearances. And one thing they say is that it's extremely unlikely that all the disciples, as well as all the 500 and more, saw the same exact thing simultaneously. And what Dr. Allison says in response to that is, well, how do you know they saw the same exact thing simultaneously, as opposed to just a kind of general collective experience? And so, as an analogy to this, he points to Marian apparitions. So, regardless of what you think about the objectivity of those, I personally am not so quick to deny at least some veridicality in at least the appearances in Zaytun. But whatever you think about those, what is undeniable is that magazines and some interviews and reports of the apparitions say thousands saw the Blessed Virgin Mary or hundreds saw Our Lady. But when you do more detailed interviews, you see that the witnesses themselves saw different things. Some would see Mary as a particular depiction in this artwork, others would see her as a different kind of artwork, others would just see a light. For example, there was an Egyptian American anthropologist who went to to one of the sites and saw a light but didn't see Mary. And so basically the argument or the analogy is something like this. You have a report of a collective sighting of some figure, but when you do more detailed interviews, you see they see different things. And so my question is, how are you confident that the disciple that is different in the disciples' case? That the disciples and moreover the 500 for whom we just have one sentence in Paul saw the same exact thing.
Yeah, that's a great question, Nahor. So let me explain. Let me answer this question in my following slides. But before I do that, so we first of all we can think about there are different group appearances, right? So one is the appearance to the 12, one group appearance to the 12, and then there's also a group appearance to the 500. Now, if we talk about the 12, right? I have already argued earlier on in my previous slides that there are all these multiple considerations which taken together give us good reason to believe that Jesus was seen as robustly physical by the disciples. And this would also indicate that there is something physical there, right? Really robustly physical there, who can talk to the disciples, who can eat fish, for example, right? We have good reason to believe that these details are true. Um, Now, whereas in regards to the Marian apparition, for example, right? If you look at the details, for example, you mentioned the case of Zaitun, right? Now, that apparition there, there is no indication that that apparition actually spoke to the crowds, right? Or they spoke to people, or that so that there isn't such indication about that. And so my point here is that this cumulative case, which I've established earlier on, concerning the appearance to the 12, right? I think that remained unchallenged, uh, regardless of despite the objection raised by Allison concerning the Marian apparition. But in addition to that, we have further arguments against this, well, we can call it Marian apparition objection, right, for short. And um, so let's look into the details, right, of this objection. Now, this Marian apparition objection, right, is basically, some researchers have claimed that this is a case of collective delusion or mass hysteria. Now, of course, Roman Catholics, most of them wouldn't think that this is a delusion. Many of them, in fact, think that these apparitions were veridical. However, some researchers have argued that they could be understood as delusion, and the reason is because, as Allison noted in his book, that there were people who saw different things, and some saw nothing at all. So you find that there were these counter traditions which were present among the crowds, the crowd of people who were there. Some did not actually see anything, and they reported that they didn't see anything. right? So there were these counter traditions, and so because of this, um, skeptics would argue that we have good reason to think that this is something intramental, right? This is something inside their mind because not everybody actually saw it together. Now, but nevertheless, even though they didn't see the same thing together, but as Allison goes on to say that with regards to these excitable crowds, they were very excitable during that time. They were eagerly awaiting such appearances. Those who do not see the hallucination may later be influenced by the accounts of others who claim they saw and be carried away by their enthusiasm, such that they also eventually begin to believe that they saw it too. Right? So it could be influenced by others, and that is how some skeptics have argued, that is how mass hysteria works, okay, influenced by others. Now, what is the problem with this objection to the resurrection appearances? Okay, so there are a number of problems, and again, it's a cumulative case. So we need to consider the context, which is very important. In the case of the Marian apparitions, there is a lack of persecution, right, for the crowds of the large crowds of people. Right, there's no persecution for them. And moreover, there's also evidence that there were some incentive present. There were incentives present. There's evidence of that. And there is also evidence of counter tradition present. As I said earlier on, there were people who acknowledged that they didn't see anything. So let us talk a bit more about these considerations. Now, lack of persecution for the crowds. There is nothing to lose for the crowds of people for claiming that they saw an apparition of Mary. On the contrary, there was already widespread agreement among many people in the crowd of the that Mary was assumed to heaven and that she had appeared to people before. So there was already widespread pre-existing belief about this concerning Mary for many many years, right? This was already present, and so this is well established in the tradition of uh, to which this many people among the crowds belong. Moreover, there is also evidence of financial incentives for attracting religious pilgrims, and this may have motivated some people to contribute to the enthusiasm, resulting in the emergence of collaborative testimony and the writing of literature asserting that thousands of people saw the miracle, even though there were counter traditions that people did not actually see the same thing and some didn't see anything. And if you talk about the case at Fatima, for example, there's also no scientific evidence that the sun actually moved, right? We know that that is true. And at Zaitun, the photos of the apparition, um, some of them could be altered. Right? So this were found to be hanged in kiosks where incense were being sold, and the apparitions were sanctioned by the Ministry of Tourism, as another researcher has documented. And so these are some of the reasons why the skeptics were not convinced, right? They mentioned this evidence. And we do know that there are cases which are fraud, right? So fraud is not uncommon. Fraud is quite common, actually. And among the cases of the claim cases of Marian apparitions, some people have claimed to have seen Mary, but later turned out to be fraud. I mean, this is also this is even also acknowledged by the Roman Catholic Church itself, right? So the Roman Catholic Church also acknowledged, yeah, I mean, of course, we all know that there are cases which are not veridical. So, for example, this case of Maria Gonzalez and her three companions, right? This group of them, they claim to have seen Mary in San Sebastian, right, in Spain in 1961. But one of them later confessed that their claims were not authentic, even though there were people who believed them, right? So they went around claiming that they saw Mary, and there were groups of people who actually believed them, but they later acknowledged that these claims were not authentic because they later confessed that she and her companions actually had used these claims to as a means to get out from the village to play actually, right? Now, these kind of considerations were not present for the earliest Christians, right? They were not trying to go out to play, right? But for them to go out and proclaim that Jesus resurrected would have to face persecution, and they'll be willing, right, to suffer for this, for making such claims. And so, given that this is the case, it is unlikely that more than 500 people and the other apostles, as well as the 12, all these people will all be willing, be happy to be included in the list of eyewitnesses of the resurrected Jesus and face persecution without fear that they'll be judged guilty as false witnesses of idolatry and condemned by the God of Israel, as I mentioned before, for misleading people to believe that Jesus resurrected, for worshipping Jesus, which is idolatry, if in fact they did not actually see the same thing together, right? Because we need to understand that ancient people were well aware of subjective hypotheses. Those ancient people, for their mindset is such that they were aware that they were not stupid, they were not ignorant of such things. They knew that, say for example, if some people drink too much wine, they will be seeing things that other people do not see, right? So people will be seeing different things after drinking too much wine. So they were aware of intramental hypotheses, of subjective appearance experiences, which are not objective reality, of hallucination. They were well aware of these things. But I've already mentioned earlier on, right? For the earliest Christians, what they were believing and claiming is that the resurrection was not supposed to be a private event, right? The resurrection was not is supposed to be a public event, something public that people can see together. That's what resurrection is supposed to mean. And so this indicates that the earliest Christians, they must have seen something, the same thing together, right? And that is what convinced them that Jesus resurrected and that he is God, such that they are willing to sacrifice for this in the context of persecution. So that is the important response. And moreover, secondly, there was also no evidence, no hint at all of counter tradition, no hint that of anyone leak out the truth that they didn't actually see something like that, even when persecuted. Right. So this is different from the case of those Marian apparitions where there were people who actually confessed that they didn't see anything like that. And so, and that's precisely the reason why many skeptics remain unconvinced by the Marian apparition, because the fact that it was that there were people, right, who acknowledged that they didn't see the same thing. And so that's the reason why the skeptics can try to explain away those apparitions as mass hysteria, right, or some kind of instrumental hypothesis. But their objection does not work in the case concerning Jesus' resurrection, where we have these considerations which are listed on this PowerPoint slide, as well as those other considerations, those 7 other considerations which I mentioned, explained earlier on. And so these considerations taken together give us overwhelmingly good reason to believe that the earliest disciples actually saw the same thing together, and this same thing was a Jesus who appeared robustly physical to them, to convince them that Jesus actually resurrected, that this is a fact of history. And this is what started the Christian church and make it the case that the earliest Christians can continue to persist in believing in this, right, despite persecution, right, to hold on to this belief and to spread it to others and to convince others to hold to this belief as well.
So those are some interesting responses, and there's a lot I would want to press you on and ask more, but I think it would be probably best to move on to my next question, which is about the presence of guards at the tomb. So this is a story exclusively recounted in Matthew's gospel, but you don't think that's a problem? A lot of skeptics, or not even just skeptics, but New Testament scholars in general, will sort of give an argument from silence that it's not in any other gospels or any other sources at all from the first century, so it's likely unhistorical. And not all arguments from silence are bad, but you just have to be very careful here. So you argue that, and you're one of the few apologists who actually take the time to defend the historicity of the guard story. So tell us why you think the guard story exhibits verisimilitude and why we should trust Matthew's report.
Now, first of all, I think we have to be careful about labeling myself as an apologist, right? There's only apologists who argue that this is the case. Well, actually, I think it's more precise to argue that there are scholars, not only apologists, there are historical, critical New Testament scholars who have argued for the historicity of the God at the tomb. In fact, Allison himself noted this in one of the footnotes in his book. He noted that N.T. Wright, for example, N.T. Wright argued that, that there's historical reason to believe that this is true, right? Craig Keener have also argued for the historicity of this detail. So there are New Testament scholars. There are other examples in the footnotes, right? You can refer to that. So there are New Testament scholars, not apologists, right? But because the word apologists have often been used in a derogative way, right, to dismiss somebody. Oh, those apologists, right? They are not actually scholars. Well, that's not quite true. I mean, scholars can be apologists too, right? Scholars can be apologists. In fact, I think that I think that everybody is an apologist in a way, right? Because everybody have a view to defend, and so yeah. So I don't like somebody people some people just dismiss some people's arguments just by saying labeling it as apologies, right? So that's the first point. So I think that there are scholars who have defended this detail, and I think secondly, I
Yeah,
think that
I
there's good
think that's
reason. To,
I think that's totally
mhm.
fair. Maybe I shouldn't have
Yeah.
said that. I actually, I have
Mm.
there's a number of scholars who have at least talked about it. So there was, oh, I can't say his name, Matti Kankaniemi or something.
Yeah.
He wrote an incredible book where he
Um,
revisits the guard story, and it's some 100 or 200 pages long, and that's an
mm.
incredible book. Dr. William Lane Craig, who is an apologist but also a reputable scholar. When I
Yeah.
use the term apologist, I don't use it in a derogatory sense, but he has an
Yes.
article defending it.
Mm.
Dr. Allison has his massive commentary on Matthew. He argues
Mm.
against it. Dr.
Yeah.
Robert E. Brown, or
Mm.
Dr. Raymond Brown, in his Death of the Messiah, he argues against it after going through the evidence. But Dr. Richard Swinburne and Dr. Craig Evans, other reputable scholars, they argue in favor of it. So there's actually a sort of mass of New Testament scholarship on this question.
Oh yes, exactly. Yeah, that's right. And now, when I say the word apologist, no, I'm not saying that you use it in a derogative way, but I'm just clarifying for
Right,
the
right.
audience, right? Because yeah,
Yeah.
the audience may right have a negative connotation associated with this term, right? So I want to clarify that we do have scholars who argue for this, right? So so that's the first point. Now the second point is that I think that in my book I have offered an additional argument, an additional consideration that contributes to the debate by showing that we have this additional reason for thinking that this account is true. Now, on the one hand, you mentioned earlier on that other sources didn't mention this, but I already explained earlier on, right, that the Gospels writers when they write, they don't include all the details they know. Very often, they just include those details which are relevant for addressing the specific needs of their audience, right? So, in the case of Matthew, there is a specific reason why he would mention this, but that reason may not be present for the author of Mark, Luke, or John. And so that's the reason why that can explain why we don't find the God mentioned in those other gospels. Now, as for Matthew, Matthew mentioning of this is very interesting because he said that this story of the gods was widely spread among no, it was widely spread among the Jews until this day. Now, if you read this verse in context, he was claiming that this story was widely spread from the time the gods, according to Matthew, that the gods received money from the high priest, and this was supposed to happen very soon after Jesus was crucified, right? So from around AD 30 until to this day, which means to the day when Matthew was written, which was around AD, right, according to many scholars. Although there are some who actually date it earlier, right? But regardless, right? So we have seen that this story, Matthew was claiming that this story has been spread for some time, right, from the very earliest day onwards until the time when Matthew wrote this. And Matthew used the word makri, the Greek word makri, until. And this word implies a continuity, right, from the past, right, from the time the gods, from the time around AD 30 to the time when Matthew was written, right. So there's this story has been continuously spread for some time among the Jews. Now, I have also mentioned earlier on that the Gospel of Matthew was written to a Jewish audience. Now, the Jewish readers of this Gospel would have easily known whether the story had been widely spread among them from AD 30 onwards or not, right? They would have easily known this. Yeah, it's just like, if I were to say that, you know, Donald Trump was the former president of the United States, and this was widely known among Americans until today. But he was a former president, right? Of course, all Americans would easily know this, right? They can easily, because they know that this story was widely known, this fact was widely known among them. Now, I wouldn't be so stupid to say that Andrew Loke was the former president of the United States until today, right? I mean, that would have been easily falsified by the audience. You're in America, right? No, so you have easily known that what I say was rubbish, was false, right? So I wouldn't be so stupid to say that if I were to persuade you to believe something I want to say, right? So if the gospel authors, if the author of the Gospel of Matthew, whoever he was, now if he want to persuade the people, his readers, to believe that Jesus resurrected, he wouldn't be so stupid, right, to tell a story that can be easily falsified by his audience. And so what this means is that he wouldn't have said this unless, as must have been the case, that he and his audience knew that it was correct, right? That this story was indeed spread, widely spread among them from AD 30 onwards until the time when the Gospel of Matthew was written. And so this implies that the story is ancient. It can be traced all the way back to AD 30. Now, during AD 30, obviously, right, those people who got Jesus crucified, the contemporaries, apostles, everybody, the public, they would have known, easily known, whether there were gods or not, right? So this means that people around AD 30 would have heard people say that, oh, Jesus stole the body when we were sleeping. So who was the we? Well, it was the gods. But who was telling this story? It was the gods, right? So this means that there must have been gods, right? There must have been gods around to tell the story. Otherwise, who told the story in 1830, right? Because they were supposed to be around in 1830, right? They were the ones who started this story in the first place, right? So this implies that there must have been gods at the tomb, which implies that this detail was true. And given that there were these gods, right? Keener goes on to say that um, well, grave robbery, but this would have been unlikely, right? If there were guards posted, because they, people would, it would be unlikely that people would still go and try to steal the body, right? If there was guards posted, because they would be very risky, right? If they were caught, right, they would be, risk facing serious penalty, right, for doing that. And so, if that's the case, then how did the body disappear, right, afterwards? Well, I think the best explanation is that Jesus resurrected, right? That's why the body is no longer there. So this detail that there were gods is highly significant because, firstly, it established that Jesus was indeed buried in the tomb, right? That he was not just thrown to the mass grave as Ehrman and some others have suggested, and which Craig Evans have rebutted very well, right? I think he spoke at your interview early on. But the fact that there's good evidence to show that there is God actually established this beyond doubt, right? That Jesus must have been buried in the tomb, and that later the tomb was found empty, and that the best explanation for that, right, is that he resurrected. And it's also important to note that those psychological theories which we discussed early on, right, mass hysteria, right, which Allison suggested in his book, right, mass hysteria or hallucination or whatever, those psychological theory cannot explain why the body disappeared, right? I mean, people can have hysteria, can believe whatever they want, but if the body is still there, the body is still there, right? The beliefs wouldn't be able to remove the body from the tomb. So how did the tomb become empty? Well, I argued in my book in detail that the best explanation is that Jesus resurrected, and that's why the tomb was empty. So the empty tomb also is an additional evidence that testify to the objectivity of Jesus' resurrection, right? The objectivity of the fact that Jesus truly rose from the dead.
Awesome. Well, to our audience, if if you're making it this far, um, you can also reach out to me. My email should be in my about page, where I can send you a link to Dr. Andrew Loke's article. I can also send you a bibliography on a bunch of resources, and or not Dr. Andrew Loke's article, his book, where he talks about the guards in chapter 6, I think page 126. So, awesome resources there. My final major question before we get to the conclusion of the video has to do with prior probability. So, okay, so you in objecting to a variety of naturalistic hypotheses for the Easter phenomena, you you point out that they conflict with what we know about how reality usually works, right? So if we're talking about a hallucination a hallucination at the origin of Christianity, I mean, a collective, polymodal, realistic, life transforming, religion starting hallucination that convinces monotheistic Jews in the divinity of Jesus as the raised Lord. I mean, such a phenomenon is extremely improbable, if not
Yeah.
impossible. For the swoon theory, if we're talking about a man who survives being crucified, who survives being flogged and beaten and then crucified for hours, I mean, and then without any medical intervention, convinces his disciples as well as unbelievers that he's raised in glory. Again, such a phenomenon is extremely improbable, if not impossible. So, my question is, can a similar line of reasoning apply to the resurrection? I mean, if we're talking about a man who is raised by God, and this resurrection in turn initiates the larger eschatological resurrection, isn't such a phenomenon also extremely improbable, if not impossible?
Yeah, that's a great question. Now, first of all, we need to clarify uh, a few things. Now, one is that this uh, we can think about probability in terms of frequency and also in terms of the causal powers or the tendencies of physical entities, right, to behave when they are left to themselves, right? So a hallucination is supposed to be some kind of intra-mental events, and looking and examining the intra mental capacities of our mind or the brain cells, right? We know that it's very unlikely that the brain cells will have the causal power to be able to generate an image of someone which is which will be the same thing as what the brain cells in another person will generate in his own mind without something outside our mind, right? That is very unlikely to happen, right? That our images, the images that's formed in your mind and my mind, well, that we'll be seeing the same thing when there's in fact nothing there, right? So we understand this based on examining the causal powers. However, if there is a God, right, then we will know that this God who created the universe, right, he would have the causal power to rise. There'll be good reason to think that he will have the causal power to raise the dead, right? And I have argued in my books that the Kalam cosmological argument, in fact, shows that there is a first cause who is a divine creator of the universe, and this first cause is the one who created the laws of nature. So, given that this first cause has the causal power to bring about laws of nature, it is very likely that he would have the causal power to raise someone from the dead. So, if we analyze this from the causal power perspective, we find that there is actually no, it's not improbable at all, right? That a god can raise someone from the dead. Now, some people may say that, well, but this kind of events are very rare, isn't it? You're saying that there was no analogy, right? But however, we have to be very careful here because in frequency, the rareness of events does not imply improbability in the context of considering an event that is supposed to be caused by a free agent, right? So, for example, I very rarely gave flowers to my wife. This is a very rare event. It happened very rarely. It's not like, say, for example, if I let go of this water bottle, it will drop. If I let go, it will drop, right? This is very frequent. This is very often, right? Because this is an event that is supposed to be a natural event that follows natural laws. So this happens very often. But me giving flowers to my wife, well, that is very infrequent. But one day, if my wife were to see flowers appear in her office with the name Andrew Loke on it, is she going to dismiss this by saying that, oh, David Hume says that such events are very infrequent and so therefore it's improbable, and so therefore I don't believe that Andrew Loke actually gave me these flowers. Now, I think that reasoning will be flawed. Why? Because the fact that I don't give her flowers often doesn't mean that it is improbable for me to give her flowers on some special occasions, right? So, for example, during our wedding anniversary, right, I may choose to give her flowers, although I sometimes give her other things as well, right? So it's not a necessity that I will give her flowers, but I can freely choose to give her flowers only on some rare occasions. And so, likewise, one can also argue that why didn't my father rise from the dead? Why didn't my grandfather rise from the dead? Well, the reason is because they were not as special as Jesus, right? So there's a reason why Jesus would rise, so there's a reason why God will rise Jesus from the dead, but not other people nowadays, um, because Jesus was supposed to be special, right? Given the religious context, which I mentioned earlier on, right at the beginning, that he claimed to be God and he offered salvation for humankind. So this context, right, given this context, right, we can see that Jesus was supposed to be somebody special, and so this will explain very well why God may want to resurrect Jesus and but not others. And so, and therefore, the objection based on the infrequency of resurrection actually fails to rebut my argument. So, in a nutshell, my response to your question, Nahoa, is that we need to consider different kinds of infrequencies. Now, if you talk about hallucination, for example, right, that is supposed to be a naturalistic hypothesis that follow natural laws, and for those kinds of events, we can exclude them based on frequencies or infrequencies, right? Based on infrequencies, because those events, natural events, are supposed to follow predictable law-like regularities, and so we can exclude them based on frequencies. And moreover, we can also exclude them based on understanding the causal powers of how it's supposed to work, right? The brain cells generating image and things like that. And so based on understanding the causal powers, we can conclude that those events will be very improbable. However, this objection, no, however, this line of thought does not apply to miracles, because a miracle is supposed to be an event that is freely caused by an agent who may have choose to do some things only on rare occasions, and only on Jesus because he is special. And so we cannot just dismiss this just based on infrequency. And moreover, once we understand, um, and moreover, the Kalam cosmological argument, for example, right, give us reason to think that there is a first cause who created the universe, and therefore this first cause, we will have good reason to believe that this first cause would have the causal powers, right, to raise somebody from the dead. Given that raising somebody from the dead, I think, will be much more easier compared to creating the universe with the fine tuning and laws of nature. I think that will be much harder to do. And so, so we have good reasons to think that that's the case, and therefore, no good reasons, right, to dismiss the case of Jesus' resurrection based on infrequency.
I think that's a fair response. I can see a little bit of Dr. Timothy McGrew's reasoning there, and Dr. Timothy McGrew is an analytic philosopher, I think analytic philosopher, who has worked on the resurrection of Jesus and the priors of miracles. He has a Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on miracles, which you cite in your book and which I can link in the description. So I think that's a fair response, that the rarity of a miracle is not evidence of the improbability, much less the impossibility of a miracle, because unlike hallucinations and naturalistic swoon theory hypotheses, it involves the action of a free agent who can act in a way that might be improbable given background knowledge.
Who may act only on rare occasions, right, for special
Right,
purposes. And so,
right.
and that's why religious context is very important here, right? Context, because we are not just talking about the resurrection of any random individuals, right? So, but rather we are talking about the resurrection of somebody who is supposed, right, to be somebody special. And McGrew also pointed this out, right, I quoted him in my book in the footnote that we need to take into account all this background information about the religious context concerning Jesus, and then we will come to realize that the so-called base rate fallacy, right, against miracles, that actually fails, right? Because we cannot just, because the base rate fallacy is based on assuming that just the resurrection of a random individual, for example. So if you have no other background knowledge, then we will think that, well, that is probably very unlikely. But then, given the background knowledge concerning the religious context, right, we will find that that objection actually fails. Yeah.
All right, that's
So the
totally fair.
context, yeah, that's right. The context plus the evidence, and plus the fact that those naturalistic alternatives can be shown to be improbable naturalistically, right? So all these three reasons added together, right, give us good reason to believe that, something actually happened in the case of Jesus, right? That he actually resurrected from the dead.
I think that's a very helpful summary of almost everything that we've been talking about up until now, which
Yeah,
brings us to the conclusion. I just want to thank you one more time for joining us. I have three more questions, or if is it all right if we do these three questions?
sure, yeah,
Okay, great. So my first, I ask these three questions to every guest. Every guest I have on the channel. So my first question is about what's a significant thing you've changed your mind on, whether from study or just from personal conversations or experiences?
Well, I have changed my mind in the sense that I now have, after studying all this in great detail, I have come to be even more convinced that Jesus' resurrection is a fact of history. Now, in my earlier days, I tend to think that this conclusion can only be established after you have established the historical reliability of those evidentially significant details, say, for example, concerning the robustness of um, Jesus' resurrected uh, body, how it appears to people, right? Which we had talked about earlier on at the beginning. So in an article which I published in 2009, and that article is also published by the Journal of Theological Studies by Oxford University Press, which I mentioned earlier on, is a world-leading academic historical critical a journal that talks about historical critical studies of the New Testament, among other things. Now, in the article, I actually argue that once we establish, right, this the reliability of these evidentially significant details, we can conclude that Jesus resurrected. So in my earlier days, I tend to think that that is very important. That is almost necessary for the case for Jesus' resurrection. Now, what I have changed my mind on is not that those details cannot be established. In fact, I have just argued otherwise, right? In the presentation, I've argued that after studying this, I've come to even be more convinced that those details are indeed reliable. But what I've come to realize after all these years of study is that even if we don't use those details, the case for Jesus' resurrection is still, the best explanation compared to other alternative explanations. So I talk about this in my book, published by Routledge, right? So in 2020, and I've also, so in my book and article, I demonstrated that the case concerning Jesus' resurrection, right, can be uh, argued using a kind of syllogistic format where we can use the laws of logic to demonstrate that, there are only essentially a few possibilities, right? So, for example, either no one actually claimed to have seen Jesus alive, or there were some people, or if there were some people, either they didn't see anything or they did see something. If they did see something, then either what they saw is something inside their mind or something outside their mind, right? If it's something outside their mind, then either it was not Jesus or it was Jesus. If it was Jesus, then either Jesus wasn't crucified, um, or he didn't die on the cross, or he did die on the cross, right? So if he did die on the cross, then though the Jesus whom the disciples saw was the Jesus who died earlier and was seen alive again later, and therefore Jesus resurrected. So we can formulate the argument for Jesus' resurrection, right, using the laws of logic to say that, okay, so um, there's only these few other possibilities, right? Either nobody actually claimed to have seen anything, or nobody actually experienced anything, or that it was a instrumental hypothesis, or they mistook another thing for, or another person for Jesus, or Jesus wasn't crucified, or he was crucified but he's just soon on the cross. And all these hypotheses were extremely unlikely, right? If we just look at it, from after we had established some basic data, that there were groups of people who actually claim to have seen Jesus. It will have been, and if you have established this, and together with other considerations, say for example, the fact that the earliest Christians were persecuted, that they are ancient Jewish monotheistic context. So I've argued in my book, in the last chapter, that there are 14 historical considerations which is well established on the basis of evidence, and based on those, right, we will have already enough reason to disprove all the naturalistic alternatives, and leave the resurrection as the best alternative. So what I'm saying here is that the case for Jesus' resurrection does not depend on establishing the evidentially significant details concerning the robustness about, say, for example, Jesus eating fish with other disciples, right? I don't have to prove that that is really what really happened, that detail is the case, in order to prove that Jesus actually resurrected. So I have come to change my mind on that regard. So I've come to realize that the case for Jesus' resurrection is actually even more powerful than what I realized at the beginning. That I don't even have to establish those details, even though I do think that there's very good reason to think that those details are true, right? So this realization, together with the good reason for thinking that those details are true, has made me even more convinced that there is overwhelmingly good historical evidence and reason for thinking that Jesus truly resurrected.
Awesome. And my second question is, what's a more personal factor that influences your worldview? So something, a reason or an experience or some culture that doesn't necessarily constitute propositional evidence. It's a more personal factor that affects how you see reality.
Yeah, so I think again, I think this is a kind of cumulative case, right? So the evidence for Jesus' resurrection is only part of a cumulative case of how I view reality. So I also look at reality based on my understanding of natural theology, as I mentioned earlier on, right? So as you have mentioned earlier on, I have also written books on the origin of the universe, the Kalam cosmological argument. So this influenced my worldview, right? It's let me know that there is a creator God who actually brought about the universe, and that we exist not as not by chance, right? But rather is by design. Because I have also I have also defended the teleological argument as well, and so there's a reason why we are here, right? And so this uh, conclusion taken together with the claims of Jesus, the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, and also the uniqueness of Jesus' gospel, right? We find that in the gospel there's something unique about the message of Christianity, which is that it tells us that, that God is a God of love, that this first cause actually loves us, right? And this is astonishing because I don't find this written in other religions. That there is a first cause who actually loves us to the extent that he's willing to sacrifice himself for us in some sense, right? So to pay for the price of our salvation. And so salvation is entirely by grace according to Christianity, and it's a demonstration of the love of God. And so I find it all this astonishing, all this amazing, right? You don't find this in other religions. And so this uniqueness of the gospel, um, together with the historical evidence for his resurrection and other things, is provides a cumulative case, for together with natural theology, for letting me know that in reality, right, that there is this God who loves me, and who provided salvation for me, and that by receiving Him, I can receive eternal life and also an intimate relationship with Him as well. And this is also something that I've experienced myself too, right? So after believing in Jesus, I have experienced this intimate this relationship with God, and enter into an intimate relationship with Him. And I think this is also important, right, for my own life journey. And so all these experience, right, all these together constitute my worldview. And so what the point I want to emphasize is that these arguments, this evidence, it's not just some kind of abstract truths, right? But it's talking about reality, concrete reality concerning the universe, concerning history, and it's something that we can also experience in our lives, in our personal lives as well.
Awesome. Here, let me pull it up. Now, we've come basically to the end of our discussion. This has been awesome. I just want to know if you have any final thoughts, any advice for me or other truth seekers, or resources that you want to suggest to our audience.
Sure. Now, the first thing I want to say is that this interview, I'm so sorry that it has taken so long. It has gone way
No, 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 no.
beyond
It's
the
fine. It's
original
fine.
length that they have suggested. Yeah. Uh, but even after all these few hours, right, we have only covered the tip of the iceberg, I should say. Because as you also mentioned at one point, that there's so many books, right, so many things that have been written about this. And I want to highlight a very important point, which is that many objections that we see nowadays on YouTube, Say, for example, those objections raised by Paulogia, right, and his audience. We find that his followers, they like to write a lot of things, a lot of comments on YouTube, raise a lot of objections. So we find that there are a lot of skeptics, right, who mention a lot of such things, right, in the YouTube comments, and they may also make some comments on your channel on this video after we have finished our discussion, right. If you post it, you may find some atheist skeptics write some comments about what we discussed today as well. Now, I want to say that these objections, these comments, they have in fact already been answered. They have already been answered in my books, in the books by Lycona and others. So I will encourage the audience, right, to check out these books, right, because you will find in these books answers to many other objections which we didn't have time to discuss today. Uh, so if the audience, after listening to our conversation, if you still have other questions which you don't find the answers in our conversation, you may well find the answers, right, in the books which we have written, and because those books are much more detailed, right, compared to what we discuss in this in this interview, right? So yeah, I will encourage, if you come across any such comments, or if you have any questions yourself, right, check out these resources. So these resources will include, right, the book that I mentioned earlier on, the book published by Routledge, and also the other book published by Cambridge University Press, and also a forthcoming book you mentioned as well. A book, the book is titled "Studies in the Origin of Divine and Resurrection Christology," and I have also other books on. And so these books answer objections by, say, for example, Bart Ehrman, um, and other people, right? Which we don't have time to discuss today, right? But you'll find answers in those books as well, and you also find answers in some of the other presentations, other interviews, and other talks which I've given. So if you go to my YouTube channel, you can find that I've given a series of talks, which is video recorded, and that can be found in my channel on the playlist on talks in English. And you'll find that there is a series of talks titled "Is Jesus God?" Right. So in that talk, you'll find that I give a quite a detailed presentation in reply to Bart Ehrman's views concerning Christology. Right. So you'll find a point by point response where I demonstrated that there are at least 9 fallacies, right, 9 errors in his reasoning that led him to the wrong conclusion. So I encourage the audience to check out these books and these videos, and also other books I've written on the Kalam and theological cosmological and the theological and the Kalam cosmological arguments, where I respond to other critics, such as people like skeptics and such as Graham OP and others. And finally, just want to wish you and your audience a very meaningful Good Friday and a happy Easter, remembering the death and resurrection of Jesus.
I appreciate that. Well, Dr. Loke, uh, you know, I'm very grateful that you've had this discussion with me. To our audience, please don't let this this interview, even if it's long, be all that you know about the subject. There's so much to explore. There's so many videos and lectures and debates. I mean, Dr. Loke has debates with Muslims and atheists, so I can share all that in the description. And also, don't just go to my description. Go to your library, go online, try to learn as much as you can, and seek truth openly and critically. So, to everyone, peace.